I was 28 years old when my entire world shifted in a single night. Up until that moment, I believed I had a handle on life, ordinary, predictable, and safe in its own quiet routine. But I was wrong. The truth is, nothing could have prepared me for the storm that would tear through my family, unravel every illusion I'd ever had about love and loyalty, and expose the darkest corners of the people I once called my own blood. What if I told you that the people you trust most, the ones who raised you, who shared your name, could turn on you in an instant, simply because of money? What if I told you that the very people who should have protected me were the same ones who left me standing in the rain with nothing but a few bags, a broken heart, and a fortune I never asked for? Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. And before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It's the best way to support me so I can keep bringing you stories that shake your heart, stories that remind you that truth is sometimes stranger and more painful than fiction. Let me take you back to what life looked like before everything unraveled. My name is Emily Carter. At 28, I was a kindergarten teacher in Portland, Oregon. My days were filled with sticky fingers, finger paints, and the innocent laughter of children who believed the world was safe. I lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in an aging brick building with creaky floors and neighbors who argued too loudly through the walls. My car was 10 years old, my clothes mostly secondhand, and my savings account barely enough to cover an emergency vet bill, let alone the future. And yet, I wasn't unhappy. In fact, I thought I had found a sense of peace in the modest life I was building. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because while I lived modestly, my grandparents, Margaret and William Carter, were quietly sitting on a fortune. Not the kind of wealth people flaunt with yachts and mansions. No, theirs was the kind of wealth you'd never guess by looking at them. They built Carter Logistics from a single truck in the 1972nd into a company that stretched across 3 states, hundreds of employees, multi-million-dollar contracts. And yet, my grandfather still drove the same faded blue Ford pickup he'd owned since I was a child, and my grandmother clipped coupons as if every penny mattered. They believed money was a tool, not an identity. Emily, my grandfather used to tell me, money can build bridges, but it can also build walls. Which one you choose depends on who you are. Those words didn't mean much when I was younger, but in time, they would become the only shield I had against the people I once trusted. My parents, Robert and Linda, could not have been more different from my grandparents. My father spent decades climbing the corporate ladder, obsessed with titles and prestige. To him, image mattered more than integrity. My mother was no different, her worth tied up in handbags, manicures, and her standing in Portland's social circles. And while they gave me the basics, a roof, food, education, what they never gave me was warmth. They were in the same house as me, yes, but emotionally, they were galaxies away. That distance shaped me in ways I didn't understand until much later. The truth is, I grew up learning not to expect too much from them. When I scored high grades or starred in a school play, they barely noticed. But my grandparents? They noticed everything. They never missed a game, a performance, a birthday. Their Seattle home became my real home, the one with the vegetable garden out back, the smell of cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings, and a porch swing that squeaked under the weight of stories we told each other. They weren't just grandparents. They were my anchor, my compass, my family in the truest sense of the word. And yet, all the while, a storm was brewing beneath the surface of our family dynamic. My father resented my grandparents for their frugality. He called them stingy, old-fashioned, blind to what he thought was his birthright, their company, their fortune, their recognition. When he demanded a senior position at Carter Logistics and my grandfather refused, telling him he had to earn it like everyone else, my father walked away. That single act carved a canyon between him and his parents that never closed. My mother only fueled the fire, whispering about how embarrassing it was that her in-laws lived so simply despite their wealth. And my younger brother, Daniel was their golden boy. 25 years old, addicted to get-rich-quick schemes, constantly pitching new ventures that collapsed before they ever got off the ground. My grandparents saw through him, but my parents coddled him like he was destined for greatness. This was the backdrop of my so-called family life. A web of resentment, disappointment, and greed disguised beneath polite smiles during rare holiday gatherings. I thought I understood it. I thought I had accepted it. But what I didn't realize was that everything, their bitterness, their entitlement, their hunger for more, was lying in wait, ready to explode. The night my phone rang with a number from San Francisco, I didn't know I was about to lose the only two people who had ever loved me unconditionally. I didn't know that grief would drag me into a war I never asked to fight. And I certainly didn't know that within weeks, I would inherit not just a fortune, but the ugliest truth about my own family. Can you imagine what it feels like to learn that the people you thought you knew are capable of destroying you for money? Can you imagine looking your own father in the eye and realizing he sees you not as a daughter, but as a rival? That was the reality waiting for me, though I couldn't see it yet. So, stay with me, because the next chapter of this story isn't about grief, it's about betrayal. It's about how tragedy didn't just break my heart, it shattered the illusion of family itself. And once the mask was ripped off, there was no going back. Are you ready to see what happened when love, loss, and greed collided in my life? Then let's continue. Family stories are never as simple as they look from the outside. Every photograph in an album, every smiling Christmas card, every polite handshake at a wedding conceals a deeper truth, layers of conflict, resentment, and secrets we learn to keep quiet. Mine was no different. My grandparents, Margaret and William Carter, were the glue that held the pieces together. But beneath their calm and measured example, the rest of the family was unraveling long before I realized it. What I'm about to tell you is the real backdrop to the chaos that would later explode. The roots of bitterness, the quiet betrayals, and the expectations that poisoned us long before money ever came into play. The story of my grandparents was, in many ways, the American dream. In the early 1972, when most people were just trying to make ends meet, they took a risk. With one used truck and more determination than capital, they launched Carter Logistics in Seattle. My grandfather drove long hauls across the state, sometimes sleeping in the cab, while my grandmother kept meticulous records from their garage. They built the business mile by mile, one delivery at a time, slowly adding trucks, then warehouses, then contracts with some of the biggest suppliers in the region. By the time I was born, the company was a regional powerhouse, employing hundreds and securing contracts across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. But here's what people never understood: they never let the wealth change them. My grandfather still wore his threadbare plaid shirts, still mowed his own lawn, still preferred fishing at the lake to any corporate retreat. My grandmother shopped department store sales, clipped coupons, and believed homemade soup was better than any dinner out in the city. They lived in the same modest 4-bedroom house in Seattle for decades, refusing to upgrade to the sprawling mansions my parents and their friends flaunted. They believed simplicity wasn't a lack of ambition, it was a safeguard against losing yourself. My father hated this. Robert Carter grew up with a different vision of success. He saw the company not as a symbol of hard work but as a ticket to privilege. He wanted the title, the luxury condo overlooking Lake Union, the recognition at social events. He thought inheriting Carter Logistics was his birthright. So when my grandparents refused to hand over an executive position after college, insisting he start at the bottom like everyone else, he felt humiliated. He never forgave them. In his mind, their refusal wasn't about fairness, it was about betrayal. And betrayal has a way of planting itself deep. My father carried that wound for decades, letting it fester into bitterness. Every holiday dinner was an opportunity for him to remind them of his wasted potential. Every conversation turned into a dig at their stingy lifestyle. He couldn't understand why they chose to live modestly when they had the means for more. My mother, Linda, only added fuel to the fire. She was the kind of woman who measured her worth in designer handbags and social invitations. She despised the fact that her in-laws refused to live lavishly, because to her, their modesty was embarrassing. How could she hold her head high at charity galas when her husband's parents drove an old pickup and wore off-the-rack clothes? To her, wealth wasn't about security, it was about status. And in that way, she and my father were perfectly matched. Both hungry, both resentful, both convinced that my grandparents were denying them what they deserved. Then there was my younger brother, Daniel. At 25, he was the golden child in my parents' eyes, though not for his achievements. To be clear, he didn't have any. He bounced from one failed business venture to another, always pitching the next big idea, always draining my parents' money, never holding down a job longer than a season. Cryptocurrency schemes, mobile apps, online stores, every idea collapsed before it began, but my parents believed in him fiercely. To them, Daniel was destined to be a success story, no matter how many failures piled up. My grandparents, however, weren't fooled. They saw him for what he was: spoiled, entitled, and unwilling to put in the work. And of course, my father's younger sister, Patricia, was another thorn in the family dynamic. She had a flair for drama, always the loudest in the room, always convinced she was being overlooked or underappreciated. Married to Michael, a man so quiet he practically disappeared into the wallpaper, she made up for his silence with her constant complaints. If there was an opportunity to play the victim, Patricia seized it. And while she never worked a day in her life, she somehow always felt cheated out of more. These were the people who surrounded me, the people tied to me by blood but not by love. Looking back, it's easy to see how their jealousy and resentment formed the perfect storm. But as a child, I just thought this was family. The subtle digs, the cold shoulders, the passive-aggressive comments, it all seemed normal. I didn't realize that beneath it was something far more dangerous, a festering sense of entitlement that would one day come crashing down on me. My grandparents saw it, though. They weren't blind. They knew their son resented them. They knew their daughter-in-law thought they were beneath her. They knew Daniel would never stand on his own 2 feet. And they knew Patricia would always find a way to cry foul. And yet, they endured it quietly, clinging to the hope that maybe, someday, things would change. They believed that family was worth giving second chances, even third or fourth. But deep down, I think they also knew that when the time came to make the hardest decision of their lives, they would have to choose between blood and values. So, let me ask you, what do you think they chose? Do you think they rewarded my father's bitterness, my mother's vanity, my brother's schemes, or my aunt's drama? Or do you think they saw through it all and made a different choice? What happened next would prove just how well my grandparents understood the people around them. The seeds of conflict had been planted years ago, watered with greed and resentment, and now the storm was gathering. The question wasn't if it would break, it was when. And when it did, it started with a single phone call from San Francisco. Are you ready to see how tragedy can expose the truth about family? Then let's move into the next part of the story. It was a Tuesday evening when the phone rang, and even now I can still remember the exact sound of it. The shrill tone cutting through the quiet of my apartment, the way it made my stomach tighten before I even picked up. Isn't it strange how sometimes, without knowing why, you sense the world is about to tilt? That night, I knew the call would not bring good news. I just didn't know how bad it would be. On the other end was a police officer from San Francisco. His voice was steady, practiced, but heavy with the kind of weight no one wants to deliver. There had been an accident, he said. My grandparents, Margaret and William, were driving home from their favorite restaurant near Fisherman's Wharf when a drunk driver sped through a red light at full force. The impact was immediate, merciless. They died instantly. The words barely registered. I remember pressing the phone so hard against my ear it hurt, as if holding it closer might change the truth. My knees buckled. I sank to the floor, surrounded by half-grated papers and the smell of stale tea. My mind scrambled to reject it. This couldn't be real. Not them. Not the 2 people who had been my anchor, my safe harbor. How could the world just erase them in seconds? Grief has a way of making time collapse. The days that followed blurred together into a fog of disbelief. I went through the motions, calling the school to take leave, answering texts from friends who didn't know what to say, pacing the walls of my apartment at night, asking questions no one could answer. How does the world keep spinning when the people who held it steady are gone? The funeral in Seattle felt like a performance. My parents arrived dressed in their most polished outfits, my father barking orders at the funeral director about costs and casket options, as if bargaining over expenses would somehow lessen the loss. My mother floated through the room like a hostess at one of her charity galas, speaking in hushed tones about floral arrangements and making sure the right people saw her tears. Daniel flew in from Los Angeles, late of course, his phone glued to his hand even as he stood beside the casket. He posted a picture of the memorial flowers with a caption about family first. A caption I knew was more for his followers than for our grandparents. Patricia, my aunt, put on the performance of her life, wailing dramatically for anyone within earshot, clutching tissues like props. But I noticed that as soon as the cameras went down, so did her tears. Michael, her husband, lingered at the edges of the room, silent as always, a shadow rather than a participant. Do you know what the strangest part was? None of them had been to visit in years. They hadn't sat at the kitchen table with my grandparents, hadn't helped in the garden, hadn't shared Sunday dinners the way I had. And yet, suddenly, they were the grieving family for everyone to see. The hypocrisy was suffocating. I stood by the casket, staring at the faces of the only people who had ever truly seen me. My grandmother's lemon verbena perfume seemed to cling to my memory even though she was gone. My grandfather's laugh echoed in my ears, the kind of laugh that made you feel safe, like everything was going to be all right. Except nothing was all right. I felt numb, almost hollow, like someone had scooped the center out of me and left me standing there, pretending to function. After the service, we went back to my parents' house for what they called a family gathering. But it wasn't about remembering Margaret and William. It was about appearances. My mother fluttered around the room making sure everyone had wine, laughing too loudly, her grief replaced by social grace. My father cornered a business associate in the living room, discussing contracts as if the funeral were just another networking event. Daniel slipped outside to take calls, his voice sharp, negotiating something I knew had nothing to do with loss. Meanwhile, I sat in the corner, silent, watching them. How could they all act as if nothing had changed? As if we hadn't just buried the people who built everything we had? A part of me wanted to scream at them, to demand they stop pretending, but I didn't. I just sat there, holding myself together with threads, waiting until I could leave. That night, when I finally drove back to my apartment, the silence was unbearable. I couldn't even bring myself to step inside my grandparents' house. It felt wrong, empty, haunted by the absence of the two people who had made it feel alive. I left it shuttered, like a wound I wasn't ready to touch. 2 weeks later, when the call came from David Rosen, their attorney, I felt a different kind of weight. He asked me to come to his office in Boston for the reading of the will. "Your parents and the rest of the family will be there too," he added, his voice careful, deliberate. Something in his tone told me that this meeting was not going to be simple. I didn't know then that this was the moment everything would break open. That this meeting would not only test the fragile threads of my family, but reveal the truth my grandparents had been quietly preparing for years. Have you ever walked into a room knowing you were stepping into battle but not knowing the weapons your opponents were ready to use? That's what awaited me in Boston. The morning of the will reading dawned gray, the kind of drizzle that clings to your coat and seeps into your bones. I arrived early, clutching the umbrella my grandmother had insisted I keep in my car for just in case. The office building was an old Victorian home, converted into a law firm, with wood-paneled walls and the smell of polished leather. It should have felt warm. Instead, it felt like the calm before a storm. What happened in that room would change everything. Every assumption I had about family, every illusion I had clung to about loyalty, every hope that maybe, somehow, blood could mean more than money. And the moment David Rosen opened his folder and began to read, I realized just how wrong I'd been. Are you ready to hear what happens when the truth finally comes out? Then stay with me, because the next part of this story will leave you questioning just how well you know the people who share your last name. The morning of the will reading felt different, as if the city itself knew a storm was about to break. Boston was cloaked in drizzle, the kind that blurred the skyline and soaked through your coat before you realized you were wet. I left my hotel 15 minutes early, umbrella in hand, the same umbrella my grandmother had once insisted I keep in my car for just in case. I remember clutching it tightly, as if the familiar weight might steady me. The law office of David Rosen was housed in a restored Victorian home downtown, its brick facade softened by ivy, its interior lined with dark wood paneling and leather chairs. It was the sort of place that seemed to whisper authority, tradition, permanence. But permanence was an illusion. Everything in my life felt fragile that day. David greeted me personally at the door. He was a man in his 60s, silver-haired, with eyes that carried both intelligence and kindness. He had been my grandparents' attorney and friend for more than 30 years. As he shook my hand, he said softly, "I am so sorry for your loss, Emily. Your grandparents were extraordinary. I'll miss William's chess games and Margaret's lemon bars. They were good people." His sincerity almost undid me. I nodded, barely managing a thank you, but before I could gather myself, the glass door swung open and my family swept in like a tide. My father entered first, his designer suit immaculate, his watch gleaming, his jaw set in irritation, as if his time were too valuable to waste. My mother followed, her designer handbag dangling like a trophy, her perfume filling the air before her words did. Daniel trailed behind, sunglasses still perched on his face despite the rain, his shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed. Patricia stormed in mid-phone call, complaining about some trivial slight at her country club, while Michael shuffled silently behind her, his eyes darting everywhere but mine. The air shifted instantly. My father didn't even acknowledge me as he announced, "Let's get this over with. Some of us have businesses to run." We gathered around a massive oak table in the conference room. My father claimed the head as though it were his throne. My mother took the seat beside him, Daniel sprawling to her right, Patricia sitting across with a scowl, Michael shrinking into the background. I sat closest to David, my presence small but grounded. David began with the formalities, his voice even and deliberate. "Before I proceed, I want to make something very clear. Margaret and William Carter were of completely sound mind when they updated their will last year. They underwent medical evaluations and took extraordinary care to ensure their wishes would not be questioned." My father snorted. "Spare us the legal jargon, David. We all know what this is about. My father built the business. I'm his son. Standard inheritance procedure. Let's just read it." David ignored the interruption. He opened a leather portfolio, adjusted his glasses, and began. "We, Margaret Carter and William Carter, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this our last will and testament." The legal language stretched on, detailing revocations of previous wills, executors appointed, and property listed. My family shifted impatiently, tapping fingers, sighing loudly. And then came the part they had all been waiting for. "We hereby bequeath our entire estate, including but not limited to all cash assets totaling approximately $8 million, our investment portfolio valued at approximately $12 million, all real estate holdings, including our primary residence valued at $5 million, and our 25% ownership stake in Carter Logistics valued at $1 million to our beloved granddaughter, Emily Grace Carter." The silence that followed was absolute. I stopped breathing. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. $26 million. All of it. To me. My father's chair screeched as he shot to his feet, face flushed, eyes wild. He snatched the document from David's hands, scanning the words frantically. "This is ridiculous! There has to be a mistake." My mother's voice rose sharp and shrill. "All of it? To her? She wouldn't know the first thing about managing that kind of money." Daniel slammed his hand on the table. What about me? I'm family too. I need startup capital for my business ventures. This isn't fair. Patricia leaned forward, her cheeks red with fury. What did you do, Emily? How did you manipulate them into this? I sat frozen, unable to form words. My grandparents, my humble, practical grandparents, had left me everything. I had never even asked them for a dime, never once thought of their wealth as mine. And yet here it was, a tidal wave crashing into the room, pulling me under. David calmly retrieved the will from my father's hands and continued. We specifically and intentionally make no provisions for our son Robert Carter, our daughter-in-law Linda Carter, our grandson Daniel Carter, our daughter Patricia Davis, or our son-in-law Michael Davis, as we have provided for them during our lifetime, and have made our reasons clear to our attorney. The eruption was immediate. My father slammed his fist against the table. This is fraud! They were manipulated! They were senile! David held up a hand. If you would all please take your seats, there is more. He pressed a button on a remote, and the screen on the wall flickered to life. There they were, my grandparents, sitting together on their old living room sofa, Margaret's hand resting on William's knee, both of them looking straight into the camera. My throat tightened, tears stinging my eyes at the sight of them alive again, even if only on screen. If you are watching this, William began, his voice calm and steady, it means we have passed on. We want to explain our decisions clearly to avoid any misunderstanding. Margaret continued, her voice firm but gentle. Robert, Patty, we love you as our children, but we have been deeply disappointed by the values you embraced. We gave you opportunities. We supported you, but you chose to value material wealth over family, appearances over integrity. And you passed these values to your children, with the exception of Emily. They went on to describe the years of missed family events, the loans never repaid, the dismissive comments about their lifestyle. They reminded my father of the time he demanded a senior position he hadn't earned, of the vacations he funded with company loans, of the constant criticism he leveled at them for not spending lavishly. They spoke of my mother's obsession with social standing, of Daniel's endless failed schemes, of Patricia's manipulations. And then, they spoke of me. Emily visits us not because she wants something, but because she cares, Margaret said. She has chosen a career that helps children, not because it is profitable, but because it fulfills her. She embodies the values we built our lives upon. That is why we trust her with our legacy. The video ended with my grandfather's final words. Money is a tool. It can either build or destroy. We trust Emily to build. The room was a battlefield of emotions. My father's face twisted with rage. My mother's eyes burned with disbelief. Daniel muttered curses under his breath. Patricia shook her head in disgust. My father finally spat out, "We'll contest this. No judge will uphold such insanity." David remained calm. Your parents anticipated that, Robert. They underwent extensive cognitive testing before finalizing this will, with multiple independent doctors certifying their competence. Contesting would be expensive and almost certainly unsuccessful. And if you pursue it, all of these records, journals, and video messages will become public record. For the first time, my family looked unsettled, their anger edged with fear. But my mother leaned toward me, her voice syrupy sweet. Emily, darling, you understand this isn't right. Your grandparents were confused. This money belongs to all of us, not just you. Surely you'll share, won't you? All eyes turned to me, demanding, accusing, expecting. My throat tightened. What could I say? What would you say if everyone you were tied to by blood suddenly saw you not as family, but as a vault to be cracked open? I didn't know then that my answer in that moment would ignite a war. Because by the end of that day, the line between family and enemy would blur forever. And what happened when I walked into my parents' house later that night would prove just how far they were willing to go. That night, I pulled into my parents' driveway in Chicago just before 6, my stomach twisted into knots. I already knew this wasn't going to be a family discussion. It was going to be a trial, and I was the accused. The house loomed in front of me, a 5,000 square foot fortress of glass and granite, cold and unwelcoming, a monument to appearances rather than love. The kind of house you admired from the street but never wanted to live in. I sat in my car for a long minute, clutching the thick envelope David Rosen had given me, and wondered if I was walking into an ambush. But I had no choice. Inside, the air was sharp with the scent of my mother's expensive candles, but there was nothing warm about it. They were all waiting for me in the formal living room, a place rarely used except when my mother wanted to impress her friends. My father stood by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in hand, his expression carved from stone. My mother perched elegantly on a chair, crossing her legs with studied grace, as if this were just another social event. Daniel sprawled across the sofa, tapping on his laptop, barely glancing up at me. Patricia paced the carpet, her heels clicking against the floor, while Michael lingered near the window, staring out, as if silently wishing he could vanish. "Sit down, Emily," my father said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I chose a chair near the door, close enough for a quick exit. My father wasted no time. "Let's be reasonable. Your grandparents weren't thinking clearly. They meant for the family to benefit, not just you. So here's what we're going to do." He placed a document on the coffee table and slid it toward me. His voice was controlled, the same voice he used in business meetings. "You'll sign over the estate to me. I'll handle the management. You'll receive 10%, which is more than generous for someone with your limited needs. 10%. Over $2 million. To them, it was charity. To me, it was an insult, a dismissal of everything my grandparents had entrusted to me. "More than enough for a teacher," Daniel added smugly without looking up from his laptop. "I need at least $5 million for my new platform. It's going to change the world." I almost laughed. This was the same brother who once spent $50,000 on an app to rate public restrooms, only to abandon it within months. My aunt jumped in, her voice sharp. "The Seattle house should go to us. We have children to think about. That neighborhood would give them better schools." Her children, who never once visited our grandparents, who sent birthday cards clearly written in Patricia's handwriting. And then came my mother, her voice sugar-coated, her eyes moist with practiced tears. "Sweetheart, you know this money belongs to the family. After everything we've done for you, your private school tuition, your braces, your summer camps, you owe us this much. We invested in you." Invested. Not loved. Not nurtured. Invested, like I was a stock that hadn't paid dividends. I nearly choked on my own silence. My father's mask of patience began to crack. "We're not asking, Emily. We're telling you. Either you sign voluntarily, or we contest the will. We'll drag your name through the courts, expose every visit you ever made to them, every word you ever said. We'll claim you manipulated them. It'll get ugly." For a moment, the room spun, their words pressed in on me like walls closing. But then I remembered my grandfather's steady voice when I was 8 years old, standing up to a playground bully. "No one can take your dignity unless you give it away." And suddenly, I wasn't afraid. I pushed the papers back across the table. My voice was steady, even calm. "Number I won't sign. My grandparents trusted me. I intend to honor their wishes." The eruption was immediate. My mother gasped dramatically, calling me ungrateful. Daniel cursed under his breath. Patricia burst into loud sobs about her children's future. My father slammed his glass so hard it cracked against the stone mantel. He strode toward me, his finger pointed inches from my face. "You have a choice, Emily. Either you sign this paper and remain part of this family, or you walk out that door and consider yourself disowned. You can't have both." I rose to my feet. My hands were shaking, but my voice was clear. "Then I guess I'm walking out." His eyes narrowed, his face twisted with anger. "Do you think you can survive without us? That apartment of yours? We own that building through one of our investment companies. Consider your lease terminated. You have 30 minutes to pack your things before we change the locks." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. He was right. Years ago, when I couldn't qualify for the lease on my own, they had offered to help. I never realized they actually owned the building. "You'll regret this," Daniel sneered, leaning back on the sofa. "That money will run out, and when it does, you'll come crawling back, and we'll remember." My mother's voice followed, cold and sharp. "We gave you everything you have, Emily. This is how you repay us? You were never really part of this family anyway." It was like being gutted with words, each one slicing deeper. Still, I didn't let them see me break. I gathered what little strength I had left, grabbed my bag, and headed for the door. As I stepped outside into the cool night, their voices still echoing behind me, I realized something devastating. They had never truly seen me as family. To them, I was just a means to an end, a key to a vault they believed should have been theirs. And now that I refused to hand it over, I was disposable. I stood in the driveway, trembling, the envelope from David still clutched in my hand. I had millions on paper, but in that moment, I was homeless, unwanted, cut off from the people who were supposed to love me. "Tell me, what would you have done? Would you have given in, just to keep the peace? Or would you have walked away, knowing you might lose everything you once believed family meant?" I sat in my car, staring at the dark road ahead, and understood this was no longer just about inheritance. It was about survival. And the very next day, when unexpected allies appeared at my side, I would realize my grandparents had prepared me for this fight in ways I could never have imagined. Are you ready to see who came to my rescue when my own blood tried to destroy me? Then stay with me, because the next part of this story will show you how strangers became my true family. When I left my parents' house that night, I drove aimlessly through the dark streets of Chicago. My car was stuffed with hastily packed bags, but no destination felt right. The city lights blurred past me as if I were moving through water. My chest was tight, my throat raw from holding back tears. I had money on paper, yes, millions suddenly attached to my name, but in reality, I felt poorer than ever. Homeless, parentless, alone. Tell me, what would you do in that moment? Would you have called a friend, booked a hotel room, or would you, like me, have simply driven with no plan, because the weight of betrayal had stolen even the ability to think straight? At some point, I pulled over into a quiet park. The air was cool, the benches slick with mist. My hands trembled as I opened the thick envelope David Rosen had pressed into my palm after the will reading. Inside was a set of documents, keys, and contact information written in his careful handwriting. At the bottom was a deed to a small cottage on the outskirts of Bend, Oregon. The property was mine, purchased years ago by my grandmother, and tucked into a trust separate from the estate. I gasped when I read the words. It was as if my grandparents had known that the day might come when I would need a safe place, a backup plan, somewhere untouched by my parents' reach. The realization hit me hard. They hadn't just left me money, they had left me protection. They had thought ahead, weaving safety nets I hadn't even known were there. That night, for the first time since the funeral, I felt a glimmer of hope. The next morning, David drove to meet me at my grandparents' Seattle house. I hadn't stepped inside since the funeral, but when I opened the door, the smell of lemon, verbena, and polished wood greeted me like a ghost of comfort. The house was frozen in time, still alive with traces of them, and yet unbearably empty. David arrived carrying his leather briefcase. With him was a man I vaguely remembered from childhood visits, Carlos Ramirez, the estate manager and handyman who had lived in the guest house for more than 15 years. He looked older now, his hair peppered with gray, but his eyes were kind, steady. He removed his hat as he stepped inside. "Miss Emily," he said softly, "I am very sorry. Your grandparents were the best people I ever worked for. They asked me to look after you if this ever happened." The simple kindness in his voice nearly broke me. Carlos had been there all along, trimming hedges, fixing fences, tending the garden. But now I saw him differently, not just as a worker, but as a guardian my grandparents had quietly put in place. As we sat at the kitchen table, Carlos revealed something I hadn't expected. The security system, originally installed by my father, had been replaced last year at my grandfather's request. He didn't trust the one your father set up, Carlos explained. Said it had too many blind spots. I updated it for him. Everything is backed up to a secure server. Then he opened his laptop and pulled up footage from the days following the funeral. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the images. My father and Daniel creeping into the house when they thought no one was looking, rifling through drawers, pocketing jewelry, slipping electronics into bags. They had stolen from the very home where my grandparents had lived their final days, less than 24 hours after burying them. "Do you want me to stop the video?" Carlos asked gently. I shook my head, though tears blurred my vision. I had to see it. I had to know the truth. And with every second, my resolve hardened. As if that weren't enough, Carlos led me to my grandmother's study. Against one wall stood a tall bookshelf filled with neat rows of leather-bound journals. Each was dated in her elegant handwriting. He pulled one down and handed it to me. "She wrote everything," he said. "Every visit, every conversation. She wanted you to know the truth." I opened the journal to a random page. My grandmother's looping script filled the lines. May 15, Robert came today. It was his first visit in 7 months. He didn't ask about our health. He launched into another pitch, cryptocurrency, needing $250,000. William refused. Robert grew angry, accused us of favoring Emily. He stormed out without finishing his coffee. William was upset the rest of the day. I flipped through page after page. It was all there. The years of tension, the constant requests for money, the disappointment, the anger, the manipulation. And alongside those entries were notes about me, small details, small kindnesses. "Emily brought us soup tonight. She helped me with the new phone. She stayed to eat. She has no idea of our net worth. She just loves us." Reading her words was like being embraced by her once more. For the first time since their deaths, I felt them with me, not in body, but in the truth they had preserved for me. By afternoon, more people began arriving. First came Dorothy Miller, my grandparents' housekeeper of 20 years. She hugged me tightly, tears brimming in her eyes. "You look just like Margaret when she was young," she said. "She was so proud of you." Then came Rosa Martinez, their longtime business partner, who knew every detail of Carter Logistics. She offered to guide me through the company's operations, promising she would help me preserve it the way my grandparents had intended. One by one, neighbors and friends showed up, bringing casseroles, old photographs, stories I'd never heard. Each person carried a piece of Margaret and William with them, and with every new arrival, I realized something profound. While my blood family had chosen greed, my grandparents had quietly built another family, a community bound not by name, but by loyalty, love, and shared values. For hours, we sat around the dining room table, piecing together not just financial documents, but memories. Rosa explained the company's profit-sharing program, which had allowed dozens of employees to send their children to college. Dorothy found a hidden drawer in my grandmother's desk, filled with letters, dozens of them my father had written over the years, demanding money, threatening estrangement if his demands weren't met. Carlos produced USB drives filled with security footage and documents my grandfather had asked him to safeguard. "Do you see what was happening here?" My grandparents had prepared all of this, step by step, like chess players anticipating every move of their opponent. They had known my parents would fight. They had known greed would consume them, and they had left me not only wealth, but weapons, truth, evidence, allies. Late in the day, as the light faded from the windows, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. "Enjoy Grandma and Grandpa's house while you can. Tomorrow morning at 10, we're coming to collect what belongs to us. Don't try to stop us, or things will get ugly." I handed the phone to David. His face tightened. "This is a threat," he said, "and it confirms everything your grandparents feared. We'll be ready. Tomorrow we'll show them that you're not alone." And with those words, I realized I was no longer the isolated, betrayed daughter. I had an army at my side. My family might have disowned me, but my grandparents had given me a different kind of inheritance. A circle of people who would stand with me when the storm came. And come it would, because the very next morning, at 10 a.m., my parents, my brother, and my aunt would arrive at that house, expecting to take everything by force. Are you ready to see what happens when a family divided by greed faces the truth? Stay with me, because the showdown was about to begin. The next morning, I woke before dawn, unable to sleep, my chest tight with anticipation. The house was still and silent, yet it hummed with a strange energy, as if it too knew that today would not be an ordinary day. I stood at the kitchen sink with a mug of coffee cradled in my hands, staring out at the mist that clung to the garden my grandparents had once tended with so much love. By 10 o'clock, this garden would become a battlefield. By 8, David Rosen had arrived, his briefcase packed with documents. Rosa Martinez came soon after, setting up her laptop at the dining table, ready to present evidence of my father's unpaid loans and Daniel's reckless schemes. Dorothy bustled around the kitchen, frying bacon and brewing coffee, insisting that no matter what happened, we should not face the morning on an empty stomach. Carlos, steady and watchful, stationed himself by the front door. The house was no longer silent. It was alive again, not with my grandparents' presence but with the allies they had left me. "Remember," David said, sliding papers toward me, "they'll try to rattle you. Don't let them. We have everything we need." He handed me a set of restraining orders, cease and desist letters, and the journals my grandmother had kept. Weapons of a different kind, but weapons nonetheless. At 9:45, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway pierced the air. My father's black sedan was first, sleek and polished. My mother's white SUV followed close behind. Patricia and Michael arrived in a cherry-red convertible, garish against the gray morning. Finally, Daniel rolled up in his overpriced sports car, the one my parents had bought him, revving the engine as if to announce himself. "They're early," Rosa noted, glancing out the window. "They want to catch us off guard." The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent, followed by fists pounding against the wood. Carlos opened it calmly. My father stood on the threshold, his expression tight with fury. "Where is Emily?" he demanded. "This is family business." Carlos's voice was firm. "Miss Emily is expecting you. Come in." They filed into the foyer, their faces a mix of anger and smug certainty. But they stopped short when they saw the living room. I was standing in the center, David at my side, Rosa at the table, Dorothy pouring coffee as if this were just another Sunday morning. And then, as the door opened again, 3 more figures entered. Judge Jonathan Pierce, a family friend and longtime ally of my grandparents, Police Chief Maria Gomez, whose daughter had once been sent to college on a Carter scholarship, and Thomas Jang, the financial advisor who had guided my grandparents for over 20 years. The shift in my family's faces was instant. Shock. Unease. My mother's smile faltered, her polished mask cracking. My father's eyes narrowed. Daniel muttered something under his breath. Patricia's face flushed crimson. "What is this?" my mother demanded. "You brought outsiders into a private matter?" Judge Pierce's voice was calm but sharp. "On the contrary, Margaret and William asked me personally to serve as witness to any disputes. I'm here to ensure their wishes are respected." Chief Gomez stepped forward. "I'm not here in an official capacity, but if anyone breaks the law, that changes." Her words hung in the air like a warning. My father tried to regain control, his tone dripping with contempt. "This is absurd. They were manipulated. We're here to correct that." Thomas Jang stepped forward, opening a folder. "Actually, Robert, I have documentation of every attempt you made to access your parents' assets without permission, unauthorized transfers, forged checks, even the time you tried to have Margaret declared incompetent." He laid the papers on the table. The room went still. Rosa added, her voice cutting, And the company loan you took in 2012 for that Aspen vacation home, $200,000, never repaid. Patricia exploded, her voice shrill. This is a setup. Emily turned them against us. Judge Pierce raised an eyebrow. I reviewed Margaret's journals myself. There was no manipulation. She was clear in her reasoning. Emily embodied their values. The rest of you treated them like a bank. My father's face reddened, his jaw clenched. He looked at me as if I were the enemy. You think this ends here? We'll take this to court. We'll drag you through the mud. David spoke evenly, almost with pity. If you contest the will, every letter, every journal entry, every video becomes public record. Are you sure that's the legacy you want? For the first time, I saw fear flicker across my father's face. He turned to my mother, who was pale now, her hands gripping her handbag like a lifeline. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, muttering about needing startup capital. Patricia crossed her arms, glaring at me as though she could burn me alive with her eyes. I took a step forward, my voice trembling at first, then gaining strength. You think this is about money. It's not. It's about values. Grandma and Grandpa trusted me because I never wanted their wealth, I just wanted their time. They knew the rest of you only cared about what they could give you. And now you've proven them right. The silence that followed was suffocating. My words weren't loud, but they carried weight. For the first time, my family had no response. One by one, they began to retreat. Michael was the first to speak, his voice quiet but firm. We should go, Patricia snapped at him, but even she seemed to sense the fight was slipping from their hands. Daniel stormed toward the door, his face twisted in frustration. My mother followed, muttering about betrayal. My father lingered the longest, his glare fixed on me. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Not by a long shot. And then they were gone, their footsteps echoing down the hallway, the slam of the front door reverberating through the house. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I'd ever known, heavy but not empty. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. Around me stood people who believed in me, who believed in my grandparents' vision, a different kind of family, a stronger one. But deep down, I also knew my father was right. This wasn't over. Greed like his doesn't vanish with one defeat. It festers, it plots, it waits for the next opportunity. And I had no idea just how far they would go the next time they came for me. The weeks that followed the showdown felt like living in two worlds at once. On the surface, I was drowning in paperwork, legal documents, financial statements, phone calls with advisors, meetings with company representatives. But beneath that layer of business, I was quietly wrestling with grief, with the crushing silence of a house that no longer held the laughter and warmth of the people who had loved me most. The contrast was suffocating. I would spend a morning reviewing investment portfolios and corporate bylaws, only to walk into the kitchen in the afternoon and find myself staring at the chair where my grandmother once sat, waiting for her voice to fill the air. I hadn't asked for this responsibility. I hadn't planned for it. But I could feel my grandparents' presence in every choice I made, urging me to move forward with dignity, to live by the values they had instilled in me. That became my compass. Their legacy wasn't the money itself. It was what the money could do if it was used the right way. With Rosa's guidance, I took my first steps into overseeing Carter Logistics. I didn't step into management directly. I wasn't arrogant enough to believe I could run a company overnight. Instead, I shadowed meetings, listened to department heads, asked questions. Rosa told me stories about how my grandparents treated their employees, how they insisted on profit sharing long before it became fashionable, how they funded retirement plans that kept families secure. Every detail revealed not just their business acumen, but their humanity. They hadn't built a company, they had built a community. And that was something I could protect. At the same time, I turned to the project that mattered most to me, the Margaret and William Carter Foundation for Education. $10 million was allocated to scholarships, arts programs, and school resources. The first initiative was close to my heart, funding laptops and internet access for underprivileged students in Portland, kids who had been left behind in the digital divide. I knew their faces, their struggles. I had taught children who hid behind excuses because they couldn't finish homework without internet at home. I had seen the quiet shame when they couldn't participate in class projects. Now, with my grandparents' help, I could change that. And the classroom, how could I ever leave it? People asked me if I would resign now that I was wealthy, as if wealth and purpose couldn't exist in the same person. But the truth was, teaching anchored me. I needed those children as much as they needed me. Every morning, I walked into that classroom and remembered why I chose this path. I stocked it with new books, new paints, healthy snacks for anyone who came hungry. I paid for winter coats quietly, sliding them into backpacks so kids wouldn't feel singled out. It was small in the grand scheme of my inheritance, but for those children, it was life-changing. And in their laughter, I could almost hear my grandparents' approval. The house in Seattle, once so empty it ached, slowly began to breathe again. At first I stayed in the guest room, too overwhelmed to enter the master bedroom. The space felt sacred, untouchable. But little by little, I began to move through the house, not to erase them, but to live alongside them. With Carlos's help, we renovated the basement into a community space. It became a place for tutoring sessions, weekend workshops, foundation meetings. Dorothy returned a few days a week, refusing to fully retire, and the smell of her pies brought back memories I thought I had lost. And then there were the dinners. My grandparents' Sunday dinners had been a tradition, one of the few constants in my life. I decided to carry that on. Every Sunday, I opened the house to the people who had stood by me: Rosa, David, Carlos and his family, Dorothy, neighbors who had known my grandparents for decades. We ate together, laughed together, shared stories. Slowly, the house that had once been a hollow shell became alive again, not with blood relatives who saw me as a target, but with chosen family who valued me for who I was. But don't think for a moment that my parents and brother disappeared. They didn't. They circled like vultures, calling, texting, sending carefully crafted messages that ranged from threats to sweet persuasion. My father called when his company faced cash flow problems, hinting that a short-term loan with handsome returns would benefit everyone. My mother reached out when her social circle learned about the foundation, suddenly eager to serve on the board. Daniel messaged me in desperation after another failed venture, asking for capital to start again. Even Patricia called at Christmas, suggesting we set differences aside and have the holidays together at my house, of course. Every time, I gave the same response: boundaries. Clear, firm, unshakable. I reminded them of the terms I had set the day of the showdown. Respect my grandparents' wishes. Stop viewing me as a source of money, and only then could we have a relationship. They never managed to meet those terms. They always wanted the money first. So I let them go, little by little. And strangely, it stopped hurting. 6 months after the showdown, I stood in front of my grandparents' graves in San Francisco, the autumn leaves swirling around me. For the first time since the funeral, I was able to speak aloud without breaking. I told them about the foundation, about the scholarships, about the laptops in Portland classrooms. I told them about the Sunday dinners, the laughter, the way their house was alive again. And I thanked them for trusting me, for seeing me, for believing I could carry their vision forward. As I sat there, I thought about everything I had uncovered in those months: the anonymous donations they had made to hospitals, the families they had helped save from foreclosure, the employees whose children they had put through college without ever asking for recognition. Their wealth had never been about status, it had been about impact, and now, that responsibility was mine. But even in that moment of peace, I knew something darker lingered. My father's words the day he stormed out of the house replayed in my mind. This isn't over, and I believed him. Greed doesn't die easily. It waits, it schemes. And I had no doubt that my family would try again, perhaps in ways I wasn't expecting. So while I built, while I healed, While I carried my grandparents' legacy into the world, I stayed vigilant. Because somewhere out there, my father, my mother, my brother, and my aunt were plotting. And when they came back into my life, it wouldn't be with kindness. Are you ready to see what happens when a family who has already lost once decides to come back for another fight? Stay with me, because what came next proved that some people will stop at nothing when they believe fortune slipped through their hands. 6 months after everything unraveled, I found myself sitting on a stone bench in San Francisco, facing the graves of my grandparents. The air was cool, the trees above me shedding their golden leaves with each gust of wind. And for the first time since they passed, I didn't feel the raw sting of grief. I felt something deeper, quieter, an ache, yes, but also gratitude. Gratitude for the lives they lived, the values they passed down, and the legacy they trusted me to carry forward. I laid fresh flowers at their headstone and whispered into the stillness, "I'm trying my best to honor you." It may sound foolish to speak to the dead, but in that moment, I felt as though they were listening. I told them about the scholarships we had already awarded through the foundation, about the students in Portland who now had laptops to finish their schoolwork, about the Sunday dinners where their friends and neighbors filled the house with laughter again. I told them the company was thriving under Rosa's steady guidance, still honoring the profit-sharing program they created decades ago. I told them I had stayed in the classroom, that every day with my students reminded me of why I chose teaching in the first place. And as I spoke, it struck me with clarity. They hadn't left me money. They had left me a map. A map to a life that wasn't about survival, but about meaning. A life where wealth was not a trophy to display, but a tool to build with. They trusted me to continue their work, not to replicate their exact steps, but to live by the principles that shaped every decision they made. And those principles, integrity, humility, generosity, were worth far more than $26 million. But I won't lie to you. The road wasn't easy. My parents and brother never stopped circling. Every few weeks came another attempt, sometimes subtle, sometimes aggressive. A text from my mother dripping with sweetness, suggesting family reconciliation. A voicemail from my father hinting at lucrative opportunities, if only I would invest with him. A late-night message from Daniel, desperate for cash, to fund yet another doomed project. Even Patricia reached out around Thanksgiving, insisting that family should be together during the holidays, though it was clear she wanted my house, my table, my resources. And each time, I had to remind myself of the boundary I had drawn. Each time, I had to repeat the truth. Love without respect is manipulation, and family without loyalty is only an illusion. I didn't slam the door on them completely, I left it open with clear conditions. Respect my grandparents' wishes. Stop treating me like an ATM. Show me care without strings attached. Not once did they meet those conditions. Not once did they come to me without their hands outstretched. And so the distance grew, and with every unanswered call, every ignored message, I realized I wasn't losing family. I was shedding chains. Instead, I built a new family. One not bound by blood but by choice. People like Rosa, who treated me as an equal, guiding me with patience. Carlos, who had stood guard over my grandparents' home like it was his own. Dorothy, who baked pies in the same kitchen my grandmother once did, filling the air with familiarity and love. Neighbors who shared stories. Students whose eyes lit up when they held their first brand new books. Scholarship recipients who cried with gratitude because doors were opening for them that would have otherwise stayed closed. These were my people. This was my family. And here's the truth I need you to hear. Money doesn't change people, it reveals them. My parents and brother were always who they were, entitled, greedy, unable to see beyond their own wants. The inheritance didn't corrupt them, it only stripped away the veneer of civility they'd worn for so long. But money also revealed me to myself. It showed me the strength my grandparents had planted in me. It showed me that I could walk away from manipulation and still stand tall. It showed me that I could use wealth not as a weapon, but as a light. So, what's the lesson in all of this? It's simple, but it's hard to live by. Family isn't defined by blood, but by love and loyalty. We all grow up believing that blood ties are unbreakable, that family comes first no matter what. But the truth is, sometimes family will be the first to cut you down if it benefits them. You can't choose the family you're born into, but you can choose the family you build, and in that choice lies freedom. Maybe your story isn't about millions of dollars or inheritance battles. Maybe it's about boundaries with a parent who doesn't respect you. Maybe it's about siblings who take more than they give. Maybe it's about friends who feel more like family than the relatives who share your last name. Whatever it is, ask yourself this: who in your life shows up for you without expecting anything in return? Who loves you because of who you are, not what you provide? That is your family. That is your legacy. When I left my grandparents' graves that day, I didn't feel alone. I felt anchored. Anchored to the values they had lived by. Anchored to the community they had built. Anchored to the truth that even in the absence of blood ties, we can still be richer than money could ever make us. But as I walked away, one thought haunted me. My father's last words before storming out of the house still echoed. "This isn't over." And I knew he meant it. Greed rarely surrenders. It hides, it waits, it plans. I could feel it in my bones one day, they would come back. And when they did, I would have to decide once again whether to fight, to forgive, or to finally close that door for good. So let me ask you, what would you do? If your family betrayed you, if they saw you only as a resource, would you cut ties completely? Or would you leave the door open, hoping they might one day change? Comment your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything and helps me bring more stories like this to life, stories about resilience, betrayal, and the true meaning of family. Because at the end of the day, we're all searching for the same thing: a place where we belong, and people who truly see us.